The morning I opened my garage, I didn't expect flashing lights, accusations, and my own neighborhood turning against me in minutes. An HOA president decided that what she was seeing couldn't possibly belong to me, and instead of asking questions, she made a call that set off a chain reaction no one could stop. What began as a routine moment on my own property suddenly became a criminal accusation, captured on camera and repeated as fact. But the more she pushed, the more the truth pushed back. What happens when confidence collides with documented reality? And who really pays the price when power is abused? Before any accusations or sirens, life in the neighborhood followed a predictable rhythm. The kind of place where mornings were quiet, lawns were trimmed on schedule, and most people kept to themselves just enough to avoid trouble. I'd lived there for years, long enough to understand the unspoken rules that mattered more than the written ones. Smile when passing neighbors. Don't park where someone might complain. And above all, don't draw attention. My routine was simple. Work, home, garage, repeat. The garage wasn't just a place to park. It was storage, workspace, and a buffer between my private life and the street. Everything I owned inside it had been earned over time, maintained carefully and kept out of sight. Nothing flashy, nothing illegal, just personal property on my own land. The HOA, however, was never far from anyone's thoughts. It was run with an intensity that went well beyond maintaining order. Rules were enforced selectively, notices appeared without warning, and authority seemed to expand whenever someone felt challenged. The president in particular carried herself like the final word on what belonged in the neighborhood and who belonged with it. Her presence alone made people double-check where they parked or how long their garage door stayed open. At first, I stayed invisible. I paid dues on time, followed the rules as written, and avoided confrontations. That strategy worked until it didn't. Subtle changes started creeping in, extra inspections, longer stares, a sudden interest in what I was doing on my own property. It wasn't aggressive, but it was persistent enough to feel intentional. There was a growing sense that something ordinary was about to be questioned, not because it broke a rule, but because someone in power decided it didn't feel right. The kind of tension that builds quietly, where nothing has happened yet, but everything feels like it's leaning toward a breaking point. The neighborhood itself made the situation worse. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and assumptions were treated like evidence. Once a story took hold, it didn't matter how long you'd lived there or how clean your record was. Perception became reality, especially when it came from someone with a title. I didn't know then that a single routine moment, something I'd done hundreds of times before, was about to be reframed as a crime. I didn't know that confidence, authority, and entitlement were about to collide with documented truth. And I certainly didn't know that the garage door opening would mark the end of quiet compliance and the beginning of something much bigger than an HOA dispute. Because in that neighborhood, rules weren't just enforced, they were weaponized. And once attention turned toward you, there was no such thing as a small misunderstanding anymore. At first, the fallout from that morning didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as procedure. A notice appeared before the day was over, citing a vague investigation into unauthorized property activity. No specifics. No explanation. Just a reminder that the HOA reserved the right to involve outside authorities if compliance wasn't immediate. The language was polished, almost polite, but the message underneath was clear. I was being watched now. Within days, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. People who once nodded in passing began avoiding eye contact. Cars slowed near my driveway. Phones were raised just long enough to make it obvious that something was being recorded. The story had already begun spreading, shaped less by facts and more by the confidence of the person who told it first. When authority speaks loudly, doubt doesn't get much room. The HOA escalated quickly. A second notice followed, this time accusing me of violating community standards by housing suspicious assets. Still no proof. Still no rule cited clearly enough to challenge. Just enough ambiguity to keep me off balance. The fines attached were small at first, almost insulting, but they arrived with deadlines and warnings that failure to comply would lead to harsher penalties. What made it worse was the timing. Every notice seemed designed to arrive late in the afternoon, leaving no opportunity to respond until the next day. Emails went unanswered. Calls were redirected. The system wasn't broken. It was intentionally slow, forcing frustration to build while control tightened. Inspections started soon after, unannounced, unnecessary, and invasive. The HOA framed them as routine, but the frequency told a different story. Each visit ended with notes taken, photos snapped, and an air of suspicion that felt rehearsed. The focus always circled back to the same place, the garage, how often it was opened, how long it stayed open, what could be seen from the street in those few seconds. The implication was constant and exhausting, that something didn't belong, that I didn't belong. Meanwhile, the narrative kept growing. What began as a single accusation transformed into whispers of criminal activity, stolen property, fake documents, connections to things far bigger than reality. None of it backed by evidence, but repeated often enough to sound convincing. Especially when it came from the HOA president, whose certainty never wavered, even as the claims shifted. The pressure wasn't just social, it was financial. Fines multiplied. Administrative fees appeared without explanation. Appeals were denied automatically, sometimes within minutes of being submitted, as if no one had read them. The message was unmistakable, resistance was pointless. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Every accusation triggered documentation. Every inspection generated a paper trail. Every fine created a timestamp. The more the HOA pushed, the more records accumulated, quietly contradicting the story they were telling. Ownership documents, registration histories, surveillance footage from neighboring properties, pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit the narrative being sold. The HOA didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't care. Power has a way of blinding those who wield it too freely. Confidence replaced caution, procedures were skipped. Statements were made publicly that should never have been. The president spoke as though the outcome was already decided, as if the facts would eventually bend to her certainty. Then came the outside involvement. What started as HOA enforcement bled into something larger. Requests were made. Files were shared. Questions were asked beyond the neighborhood, and with every step the assumptions began to unravel. Records didn't match the claims, timelines contradicted accusations, ownership trails led somewhere unexpected. The shift was subtle at first, a delayed response, a follow-up request for clarification, a silence where there had once been immediate action. The certainty that had driven everything suddenly stalled, replaced by something far more dangerous to those who built their authority on accusation alone. Scrutiny. The HOA doubled down. New violations appeared overnight. Landscaping issues, noise complaints, alleged safety hazards, none of them substantial on their own but overwhelming in volume. It was a strategy of attrition. Bury the target in paperwork and hope exhaustion did the rest. But the desperation showed. The rules being enforced now were obscure, selectively interpreted, sometimes outright misquoted. Neighbors began to notice, not everyone but enough. The same people receiving warnings for minor infractions started comparing notes. Patterns emerged, similar language, identical deadlines. The realization that enforcement wasn't about compliance, but control. Still, the HOA president remained unshaken in public. Her confidence grew sharper, her statements bolder. She spoke as though the investigation would confirm everything she'd claimed and more. She hinted at outcomes without understanding the scope of what had already been uncovered. Because by then, it wasn't just about a garage or a car. As records were examined more closely, inconsistencies surfaced that had nothing to do with me. Titles that didn't line up, transfers that made no sense, properties linked through paperwork rather than proximity. What initially looked like a personal dispute began pointing toward something systemic. And that's when the tone changed. Requests turned into demands. Interviews were scheduled. Documentation was required, not just from one homeowner, but from the HOA itself. Suddenly, the organization that thrived on controlling others was being asked to explain its own actions. The reaction was immediate. Emergency meetings, revised statements, attempts to reframe past decisions as misunderstandings. But it was too late. Too many words had already been spoken, too many accusations documented. The neighborhood felt the tension. Conversations stopped when certain people walked by. Notices appeared on doors that had never received them before. The illusion of stability cracked, revealing fear underneath. Because when authority is questioned, it often lashes out before it collapses. The HOA president became harder to reach. Emails went unanswered. Public appearances stopped. Decisions that once took minutes now dragged on indefinitely. It was clear something had shifted behind closed doors, something no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. And still, the fines kept coming. Each one felt less like enforcement and more like retaliation. A last attempt to maintain leverage while the ground gave way beneath them. but leverage only works when the other side has something to lose. By this point, the narrative had inverted. The accusations that once isolated me were now drawing attention to the people who made them. Neighbors who had stayed silent began asking questions. Why so many violations? Why so much secrecy? Why did the story keep changing? The answers never came. Instead, another notice arrived, short, carefully worded, announcing a temporary pause on enforcement actions related to the ongoing investigation. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence where confidence used to be. It was the clearest sign yet that the truth was no longer controllable. Because when power stops speaking, it's usually because someone else has started listening more closely. Everything came to a head the moment the investigation stopped being quiet. What the HOA president had treated like a personal crusade was suddenly out of her control. Records were pulled, timelines reconstructed, and statements compared against hard evidence. And that's when the story she'd repeated with absolute confidence began to collapse in real time. Ownership documents proved the car had been registered to me for years. Purchase records predated her accusation by nearly a decade. Surveillance footage showed the same vehicle entering and leaving my garage hundreds of times without issue. Then came the moment no one expected. The focus shifted away from me entirely. Questions were redirected, not about the car, but about why the HOA president had made such a definitive accusation without verification. Why she'd pushed law enforcement so aggressively. Why similar complaints, tied to different properties, all traced back to the same small circle of HOA leadership. What was framed as vigilance now looked like a pattern. And once that door opened, everything behind it spilled out. Irregular transfers, questionable registrations, vehicles reported, reclaimed, and resold through channels no HOA should ever touch. What started as one false call unraveled into something much larger, something that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding or overreaction. The confrontation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The HOA president's authority evaporated the moment facts replaced accusations. Her certainty was no longer intimidating, it was incriminating. Every notice she'd issued, every fine she'd signed, every statement she'd made was now part of the record. The power she wielded so freely had documented its own misuse. By the end of that day, the narrative had completely reversed. I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was watching accountability catch up to someone who never believed it would. And as the truth surfaced piece by piece, one question hung over the entire neighborhood: how much damage had been done before anyone finally paid attention? The aftermath didn't arrive with celebration or noise. It arrived with paperwork, silence, and consequences that could no longer be delayed. Once the investigation concluded, the HOA's authority, once absolute in tone and unchecked in practice, was reduced to something far more fragile. Enforcement actions tied to my case were formally withdrawn, not as a favor, but because they could no longer be defended. Fines were reversed. Notices were voided. The records that had been used to pressure and isolate me were quietly corrected, as if erasing them might undo the damage they had already caused. But the real impact reached far beyond my driveway. The HOA leadership structure began to unravel almost immediately. Positions that once seemed permanent were suddenly vacated. Committees were restructured. Oversight bodies stepped in where there had previously been none. What was once a tightly controlled system built on intimidation and selective enforcement was now forced into transparency. Audits followed, not just of finances, but of authority itself. Years of unchecked decision-making were examined under rules that had long been ignored. Patterns emerged that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Complaints that had been buried resurfaced. Enforcement actions that targeted certain homeowners disproportionately were reevaluated. The very rules that had been weaponized were rewritten, stripped of vague language that allowed personal bias to masquerade as governance. For the neighborhood, the change was unsettling, but necessary. People who had lived cautiously, afraid of attracting attention, began to reclaim a sense of ownership over their own properties. Garages opened without hesitation. Notices were questioned instead of accepted. The assumption that the HOA was always right no longer held. And for the first time in years, silence wasn't enforced, it was earned. The HOA president's influence disappeared quietly but completely. Titles meant nothing without trust, and trust doesn't survive exposure. Her name became associated not with leadership but with overreach, with arrogance, with a failure to understand that authority without accountability eventually documents its own collapse. What lingered wasn't revenge, it was relief. Relief that truth had mattered, that records had spoken louder than assumptions, that confidence built on intimidation had finally encountered something it couldn't overpower: evidence. For me, life returned to routine, but not the same routine as before. There was a clarity that hadn't existed earlier, an understanding that compliance without question invites abuse, and that silence often enables the very behavior people fear. The garage door still opened the same way it always had. The car still sat in the same place, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer just private property. It was proof that ownership, when documented and defended, cannot be redefined by someone else's entitlement. The neighborhood learned something too. Rules exist to maintain order, not to elevate individuals above it. Authority exists to serve, not to dominate. And when power is exercised without restraint, it doesn't just target one person, it poisons the entire community. The most lasting change wasn't written into HOA bylaws or meeting minutes. It was written into how people saw themselves within the neighborhood, as residents, not subjects, as owners, not suspects, as individuals with rights that didn't disappear just because someone else wore a title. Looking back, it's striking how quickly a single assumption escalated into something so destructive. One call, one accusation, one refusal to ask questions before making demands. And yet, it took years of quiet pressure before anyone felt empowered to push back. That's the real cost of unchecked authority, not the fines, not the inspections, not even the investigations. It's the erosion of trust that takes hold when power is allowed to operate without accountability. In the end, the outcome wasn't about winning a dispute. It was about restoring balance, about reminding an entire system that legitimacy comes from fairness, not fear. That rules mean nothing if they're applied selectively. And that truth doesn't need confidence. It just needs time and documentation. The HOA still exists. The neighborhood still functions, but the culture is different now. Louder voices are questioned. Decisions are documented. Transparency isn't optional anymore, it's expected. And all of it traces back to one moment when confidence collided with reality. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to intimidation isn't confrontation, it's patience, it's records. It's letting those who abuse authority speak long enough to prove exactly who they are. The lesson isn't complicated, but it's easy to forget. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It disappears when it's exposed. And once that happens, there's no garage door, no title, and no accusation strong enough to close it again.